Hi, everybody. My name is Ricia Chansky Sansonito. I'm a professor in the Department of English at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, and I also direct the University Oral History Lab there. The Oral History Lab is just a few years old. The Oral History Lab grows out of two previous oral history projects that I did, and that's also my answer to the question, how did I come to be doing the work that I'm doing today? Hurricane Maria made landfall in the Puerto Rican archipelago on September 2017. It followed only 2 weeks after Hurricane Irma. And so both of these hurricanes together in rapid succession created mass devastation across the Puerto Rican archipelago. When our campus, the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, reopened in late October, we did so because we knew that our students had a lot of needs that weren't being addressed, and our community members also had a lot of needs that weren't being addressed. And so every professor, when they came back to the classroom, was asked to distribute a survey of students' material needs. My previous training for my doctoral program and the early years of my research was in autobiographical narratives. How do people tell the stories of their lives? And that's multimodal. It happens in many genres. Facebook is a way that we curate our lives. Music can be a way that we curate our lives, and that's in addition to printed and bound narratives. So that's my training. And when we returned to the classroom for that material needs survey, I decided to take a little bit of my training and say, students, if anyone would like to write a brief hurricane memoir and tell me what you passed through, I would be happy to read it. It wasn't graded, it wasn't formal, it wasn't an assignment. And in the next classroom, every single student had a hurricane memoir that they wanted to share with me. Almost all of them were written with pencil on paper because nobody had electricity to turn on a computer and type out and print a narrative. And I read them by candlelight because it would be 96 days before we had electricity returned in our own home. And so the impetus for my project is the understanding that there is a lack of space and place for people to voice their experiences in the aftermath of disaster. But in addition to that, I stood in a water line for 8 hours one day waiting to get potable water for myself and my elderly neighbors. And in line behind me was one of the students in my classroom. I felt as though it was impossible to return to class with a business as usual or teaching as usual approach after sharing that experience. There was no need for us to pretend that this hadn't happened to us, and there was no need for us to think about each other as separate from that experience. And so I really started thinking about disaster pedagogy, or the role that pedagogy can play in the aftermath of a disaster, and my project expanded from there. Okay, so my big bet or my project has two layers of things that we're trying to reshape. I'm going to start with the broader one, and then I'm going to go to the more specific one. In broad terms, what we are trying to do is we are trying to rewrite the climate story. Multiple climatologists agree that climate data being distributed to the public is not enough to cause people to take action and embed themselves in action that will address, mitigate, or even halt the climate crisis. And there are two reasons why climatologists are saying that. First, the climate crisis is so large. Finding a single place to engage can be very, very challenging for people. It's almost as if the data being shared on the climate crisis is not humanized in a way that's digestible for people. In addition to that, the wall of climate information that's coming out is causing people to have what can be called future phobia, fear of the future, but what can also be called pre-traumatic stress syndrome. I look at this issue. It is so big. I cannot find a way to connect with it. But in addition, it's so scary. I can't figure out how I can address it. And so what we're doing with our oral history project to combat this future phobia is we're trying to rewrite the climate story by saying the climate story is this big, giant thing that's all encompassing, but it is also millions of little stories. And so if climatologists agree that their climate science and their climate data is not galvanizing a public, what happens when we take life stories and life experiences and bring it together with the climate science? How do we rewrite the climate story? But the more local aspect of that, or perhaps the more approachable piece of that, is that the university system is set up in a way that we have power hierarchies and power dynamics. And so we tend to say the professor is the knowledge producer and the student is the knowledge consumer. And so that puts our young people at the universities at a disadvantage, because it reinforces this idea that they don't have anything to contribute. They just need to sit and listen to experts. And if we expand that to university community partnerships, we again get into a very false power dynamic that the person at the university is the person who holds the knowledge, and maybe there's something interesting happening in the community, but the professor should collect it, study it, protect it in a way that's appropriate under the university schema. And these are very false power dynamics that undercut the agency of students and our young people who have a lot of power and a lot of ability. And it undercuts the value of experiential knowledge that our communities hold, that in fact can provide us with a great deal of information to augment climate science. And so the secondary thing that our project is doing is it's undermining intergenerational colonial practices. It's undermining racist systems that say that some people's knowledge is worth more than other people's knowledge. So we're shifting the dynamic between who is a knowledge producer and who is a knowledge consumer. And I would say that our digital archiving and dissemination programs are very important parts of that. We're in a pilot project right now, and it's a digital justice project. And what we're trying to think through is what happens if the university is not the leader, the director, the head of a project? What if we're the support system? And what if we talk to community partners to say, what are the stories that you want to tell? And so we're working with 4 mutual aid organizations across the Puerto Rican archipelago right now that have essential post-disaster climate justice stories to tell us. So, for example, disaster capitalism is when a community is disadvantaged in the aftermath of a disaster and can't really protect itself, and an external agent comes in and says, because I have capital, I'm going to purchase your resources, etc. And so we're working with Colectivo Perlarte, which is in the underserved neighborhood of La Perla. This is a neighborhood that was founded in the early 1700s. It was founded because Spanish colonial law said you cannot have a butcher within the walls of a city, and you cannot have a cemetery within the walls of a city. And so this was a neighborhood that was formed initially by enslaved peoples and then populated by their descendants. And in the contemporary era, especially in the post-disaster era, many affluent people have come in and said, hey, I really like your oceanfront neighborhood. What if I bought it and moved you out of it someplace? And so this is an example of the type of disaster capitalism that is happening in contemporary Puerto Rico. With our partners at Colectivo Perlarte, we have done a community interviewing project in which residents have told the stories of the histories of buildings and stores and places in this neighborhood so as to demonstrate the rootedness of the community. And then based upon these interviews, they have painted a mural on one of their buildings in La Perla, which is the most under-resourced neighborhood in all of Puerto Rico, and faces into Viejo San Juan, which is the most affluent neighborhood in all of Puerto Rico. And the mural is about the long history of La Perla as told by its residents. And there are embedded QRC codes in the mural so that any visitor may be linked directly to the oral history narrative. And then those QRC codes expand out into the neighborhood to the sites that are talked about in the oral history narrative. I think it's really important to start building something. Passing through Hurricanes Irma and Maria was extremely disempowering. And when I looked around at what other people were doing, I really wanted to become involved with that. I am not a person who can put a roof back on a house. I'm not a person who could be classified as a first responder, but I do classify our work as that of third responders, those who are working to rebuild and to think about rebuilding. And in our case, storytelling or having your story listened to resituates a person who has been disempowered in the aftermath of disaster. Telling your story helps you organize what happened to you. Telling a first-person narrative in which you say, I did this, I did that, it helps you think of yourself as a gentle, powerful, a person who gets things done. And that has a ripple effect. Once one person in the community says, wait a minute, I did do something and I'm able to do something, the person next to them and so on keeps this momentum going. And so for me, it was thinking about what are my capabilities? What are the areas that I have previous experience? I was trained to study autobiographical narratives. I am a teacher. How can I take that and build a form of mutual aid out of it? Listening provides dignity. There's dignity in witnessing somebody in a narrative transaction, and that is part of mutual aid. What can you give? And I think sometimes we think, well, we have to give money or we have to give this very specific skill. And I don't believe that that's true. I believe that we all have gifts, we all have strengths, and they can all be contributed in different ways. And so I think it's all of our jobs in this moment within the climate crisis to say, what is it that I can build?